Muy buenas tardes o días quienes estén viendo esta grabación. Esta es la primera entrevista que de ahora en adelante vamos a empezar a hacer en el ECCEN, el Centro de Interfacultades de Derecho, Economía y Negocios de la Universidad de Chile. Y vamos a comenzar hoy conversando con Heinz Klug, que es profesor de Derecho en la Universidad de Wisconsin-Madison en Estados Unidos, pero además visiting professor, o sea, profesor visitante en una universidad cuyo nombre es muy difícil, así que si me equivoco, Heinz me tiene que corregir. No.
Witwatersrand.
Witwatersrand, ok. Muy
Perfect.
difícil, lo siento, pero es una universidad, la mejor universidad en Johannesburgo, en Sudáfrica. Y siendo muy joven, Heinz trabajó en la Comisión Constitucional del Congreso Nacional Africano, que fue justamente, era el partido de Nelson Mandela, que fue el gran líder, ¿no es cierto?, que terminó con el apartheid y que encauzó el proceso democrático sudafricano a lo que conocemos hoy día. La conversación, desgraciadamente, tiene que ser en inglés, entonces vamos a cambiar de idioma ahora, pero ustedes pueden seguir el fraseo abajo. Thank you very much, Heinz. It's a great pleasure discussing with you today.
Thank you again.
I should say something first in Spanish. Let me switch back to Spanish once again. Heinz estuvo toda esta semana en Santiago y se reunió con muchas personas de la Convención Constitucional, conversó a diestra y siniestra con convencionales, con autoridades, con académicos, estaba invitado por la Universidad Diego Portales, y entonces se pudo armar una impresión interesante de alguien que, siendo experto en procesos constituyentes, viene a Chile, por segunda vez que viene, y puede por lo tanto contarnos un poco cuál fue su impresión de lo que vio y de las conversaciones que tuvo. Así que lo que vamos a hacer básicamente es hablar de eso por unos 20-30 minutos. Okay, switch back to English once again. So Heinz, you spent this last week in Santiago, and you discussed with many people. I would like to ask you, what impression, general impression, do you have in this week? What kind of feelings do you have after this meeting so many people and discussing so many hours about the Chilean situation compared with the South African one? What would you like to express to our audience?
Sure. I mean, firstly, it's been an extraordinary week. For more than anything else, I've learned an enormous amount. But it's been an extraordinary week because people have been so generous with their time. And I've had such a good chance to meet with, as you say, a range of people across a number of different political groupings, and to learn from people about their concerns, the way they've seen events that are taking place. And of course, I visited in Chile for the first time in July of 2019. And the world is very different now than it was when I first visited. I was here just for a conference. And what's really interesting, of course, I think the events that took place in late 2019 and were people expressed the shock that brought to themselves and to the society. And that means that there's a lot of people that have a great deal of concern. And I pick up that concern from a lot of people unsure about what is, the society. And some people really expressed as if they really feel things were unstable, insecure. And that, of course, for me is a very different experience, because the South African process was quite violent, quite insecure for a long time. And so my sense, at least of Santiago in this week, of course, it's just 1 week, is that things are actually a lot more settled, a lot more secure than I would have imagined.
Okay.
That people, but of course, people are fearful of the future. They're not fearful of the present. Things seem quite calm at present. And we had demonstrations and actions right through the process until our democratically elected Constitutional Assembly in South Africa got going. So yes, there's these concerns, but at the same time, what has been really interesting to me is in speaking to people engaged in the process, there's also a certain calmness that now that the convention has been through a very difficult start, and from my experience, both in South Africa and other parts of the world, that first part, that deciding how to decide, right, trying to work out how we're going to make decisions, is always the hardest. And it's very divorced from.
We're talking about writing the bylaws by which the convention will guide itself. So it took us basically 3 months to get there. In your view, those 3 months, it's a reasonable time. Would you think? Or did we spend too much time?
No, it's not too much time at all. This is often the hardest to crack. In a way, so in South Africa, we had 3 years, nearly 3 to 4 years of argument about precisely that before we could get into the second constitution-making process, the democratic process, because there was no agreement on how to decide.
Can you tell us these two things? Because in South Africa, there were 2 processes. One, which I don't know exactly why did end up in a second process. So can you explain us a little bit briefly?
Sure.
Why did we have, is a failure the first, or is a continuation?
No, it was a different process. And the reason for that is because from the beginning, the demand from the majority was to have a democratically elected constitutional assembly, exactly what you have now. That was the demand. But the other side, the power at the time, would not concede that demand. They wanted a negotiation around a table where they had equal power to make the decision. And that was the fight that went on from 1990, when the democratic opening began, until 1994, when the first election was held. And that first election, in a way, was the kind of election that you had just a little year ago that elected the Constitutional Assembly. So in that period, they would not agree to that. So they wanted that there had to be an interim constitution that would control, so again, so that there would be no legal break, that there would be legal continuity, right? So a constructed constitutional process. And so the first 4 years were arguing about what the conditions would be for that process.
Okay.
Right? And so the agreement that is in the interim constitution included the rules for how the assembly should be established.
Okay. Now,
but not for how it should be run. That they still had to do themselves. But that was much easier. We had the basic rules in place. But it took 4 years to get there. You did it in 3 months. That actually is quite impressive.
Well, we come from a less, even though it was quite traumatic, the social explosion, it's less conflictual than what you were having after decades of apartheid. So
well,
it's clearly...
you've also had a democratic government in place now for a few years, right? So if in a way, we had that whole period that you had from 1988 to the present, we had from 1990 through 1996, a much more compressed time in that way.
Now, one thing that it's happening here is that the prestige of the assembly started very high, and the trust of the people in the assembly was very high. But in these initial 3 months, to some extent, this has decreased. And I wanted to ask you if, in your experience, do you think this is something we should be aware, we should be concerned of, or it's a bit the traditional or some expected pattern, given that in these first months we are not talking about the rules of the game, the future rules of the game, and the reason why they got elected, but they are talking about internal rules, which is not very sexy for. I
think that's correct, right? That there's a great deal of hope as everybody comes together and sits down, and everybody expects something to happen. And for the first period, you're busy trying to work out how to even talk to each other and how to actually have organizational ways to go forward. And that's not interesting to the population. That's not the issues that people want to, why they asked for this convention in the first place. So that's not surprising. not surprising. On the other hand, it should be something that people have to be aware of who are engaged in this, because once they start talking about substantive matters, they're going to want to reach out to people so that people are aware of the conversations, know what and then they can see that things are starting to actually happen, that people are starting to engage the issues that matter for people. And then you'll see a change in attitude in terms of the convention. You know, what was interesting in all my conversations, I don't see anybody saying there's an obvious alternative. Right? So the obvious alternative I understand is to just stay with what is. But of course, what is has been really, the population has said, no, thank you, because that's why where we are today, right? Yeah. And that happened in our situation as well. If it failed, what would happen? Well, for us, if it failed, it would just be back to conflict. And in a way, if it fails, you're back to an unsustainable something, unsustainable condition. And it's interesting, but I don't think anybody really wants that. Some people may think they want that, but in fact, they want the present. They want that things are settled right now, so they think it would stay this way. But of course, I don't think so. I think that it's very calm right now because people have hope in this process.
Okay, so let me talk about this kind of psychological element that you're mentioning. You're talking about hope. That's one very constructive feeling, which is fine, but also people have fear, and they are concerned by the new rules of the game, etc. In your discussion, you were at you went to the assembly itself. You talked to people there. You went to the Universidad Diego Portales. You went to Centro de Estudios Públicos. If you would like, if you could talk about a little bit these two kind of antagonistic feelings, fear and hope.
Right.
What can you tell us? What did you assess in this?
I think on the side of fear, there are people who are well situated now, who are very concerned that somehow the rules of the game are going to change so that their lives will be turned upside down. But at the same time, when we look on that side, there's also, for people who are looking to a future, there's uncertainty of what that future is going to be, even from the side of people who wanted to see change, right? So there is uncertainty, and that's not a surprise, particularly at this point when things are just beginning to turn to the substantive matters. This is not a surprise at all. And our uncertainties continued right through that period in South Africa until the final constitution. And in fact, a certain amount of uncertainty remains because it then has to be implemented and has to go into force. But at the same time, what's interesting, at least from our context, is as people got to see the process, got to see people engaging with one another and seeing the different options that are put on the table, then people will slowly but surely recognize that it's not going to be the end of the world. Yes, the rules of the game will change in part, but at the same time, both sides will have to come together, because it's no good to have something that's got such small support. And it's interesting, your rules already say it can't have small support, it has to have 2/3 support. That builds a great deal of commonness. And what happens in the end of the process is people, at least in our context, even if they were not happy with everything, preferred that there was something that collectively could take us forward. And I would
the only point is that
if that wasn't the case here.
If I can interpret a little bit the concerns people have, is that of course this 2/3 will create norms which are approved collectively by a large number of people, but it may also leave aside from the constitution things in which we don't agree to that much. So the concern is that some rules may eventually not be protected by the constitution because they can be massively approved, but not as massive as the 2/3 requires. So.
No, that is true. So if there's rules that, I mean, think about this too. The whole point of a constitution process like this is to create a sustainable democracy. So there will be decisions that will be left for the future that may not get agreed upon here, or a large group may agree. And then that goes into the democratic process going forward.
In the case of South Africa, for example, there were important things left aside from the constitution.
Oh, yes. I mean, well, remember, even if something's included in the constitution, it's not solved, it's not resolved completely, right? So take the question of mineral rights. South Africa is a mineral-based economy, and so the corporations are obviously very concerned. Now, the property protections in the South African constitution were not as strong as the corporations would have liked, so that some people would have liked, but they recognized there were protections. And the new government, of course, also wanted to make sure that mineral rights the benefits would go to the majority of the population, which had been excluded historically. And so by 1996, we get a new constitution. It takes a few years for the government to write new law and negotiate that law with different parties for the question of mineral rights. And so people who had mineral rights that they had invested in and that they had done exploration of and were defined, they were guaranteed those rights into the future.
Yeah. Let me ask you.
When rights were purely speculative, right? When somebody had said, oh, I have this area here, I have the mineral rights, therefore under that ground that must be mine. If they were too speculative, then the new law didn't recognize those rights.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one aspect of the problem that we have been discussing as well here, the speculative process by which people can get access to those rights without really wanting to explore or
without investing, without putting serious investing in. Yeah. And so in a way it recognizes investment, but doesn't recognize speculation. And that's you can draw these lines in different places over time.
Let me put some a contextual question, because in the 90s it was the kind of the people in which the Washington consensus was predominant.
Supreme, everywhere.
Yeah, supreme everywhere. The USSR had already collapsed. So to some extent, the question of property rights was pretty much in favor of a very kind of market-friendly, if you want, conception of property rights. Mm-hmm. Now, 30 years after that, we are not back to the Soviet times. Do you see in the current context, in the discussions among constitutional experts in the world, in the many assemblies or congresses to which you attend, do you see discussions which differ significantly in terms, for example, of property rights to this kind of approach that you already introduced in South Africa at the time, which is basically what we have today?
So think about it. At the time we introduced that was at the height of the Washington Consensus in the early 90s, right?
Exactly.
But in fact, because we had issues of restitution and land that had been taken under the old regime, we could introduce into our property clause a certain balance compared to just a pure, and that was accepted. And even though, the ANC government itself later, under Mbeki particularly, took many of the neoliberal solutions that were on the table. And the Constitution didn't preclude a more conservative policy. What the Constitution did was provided space for alternative policies as well. And so what you see happen with respect to particular groups of rights in South Africa, property with respect to land claims or housing or settlement, that is a little more open than it might have been before. Today, in fact, I think there's an understanding around the world, even in the US, that property rights cannot be as absolute, or maybe they were never as absolute as some people thought. Right? There was always some mediation. And in fact, now we're just talking about it more openly.
And we were, one thing that I would like eventually, if you can explain a little bit, because it was we had a glass of mineral water in the terrace of your hotel, but we were talking about the property rights of communities. So could you explain a little bit that very briefly, because we don't have much time.
Sure.
But I believe it's interesting because that shows a little bit a nuance in terms of the discussion we're having here. And I have the impression that concerning some property rights of Aborigines people, that can introduce new dimensions. Can you eventually discuss a little bit that?
So in South Africa, there were very different kinds of tenure rights that were recognized for the African majority as compared to the white minority who had full title. And so in the period afterwards, it became a question of, well, what about the rights for people who lived in communities and communal, so-called communal land? But also when some properties that were restituted back to communities, how would communities now control that property? And so there was a law passed that allowed communities to hold property communally, collectively. But that law required communities to set up the rules by which that they could hold that property. They had to select a committee to run the property, to control it. It had to be democratically elected. It couldn't have gender bias because it had to fit with the national constitution. But when you look at it closely, what's really interesting is, of course, there are different forms, right? Everybody said, oh, this is collective property. This is different. But then I turn around and I say, wait, if I own a condo in a condominium, right, a straight American condominium, or in New York City, in some of the co-ops that they have there, these are high-end, expensive properties where you buy in, and either you buy shares in co-ops or you buy your piece of land up in the sky in when you have a condo, right? But those have a set of rules. A condominium, you may own your condo, but you also have a collective part that you pay your annual fee to. You have a committee that decides how to maintain the whole building, what highways. This is not that different, right? It's seen as different because the one came from the private property side and was recognized, in the 70s and 80s as condominiums developed. And the other one comes from a more traditional conception. And the people do have a very different worldview of their relationship to that land. But it can be managed in a way. So the big issue, of course, is how do I get in and how do I exit if I need to leave, if I want to leave. Yeah. In the South African case, these community property associations, is what the name was given, has a procedure that in fact is not that different to your procedure in the co-ops of New York. In the co-ops of New York, if you want to enter, if you want to buy in, you have to be interviewed by the co-op management board, and they will only allow you to buy in. It's not a free market. They'll only allow you to buy in if they agree. Yeah. If you want to exit, if you want to leave, you want to sell, you can't sell in the open market. Yeah. You first go to the board, and the board will say, okay, we accept the person who wants to buy. And if they don't accept that person, then they have to buy it, right? They have a right of first refusal, but that doesn't mean they can just say no.
So that's interesting. But this was made by law. It was not a constitutional provision. It was a law that was passed later on.
That was a law that was passed after, but the Constitution provided the space. So all the Constitution did was it said it recognized multiple forms of tenure, okay, right? Which is not that's a principle that is not defining things. Yeah. So later in law, they do the work to actually define what that would mean.
In your discussions during the week, do you think did you have can you tell us if you have an assessment in terms of how keen is people to having a constitution that really provides space rather than prescripting very precise elements?
So what's interesting to me is I think, of course, a lot of people at this moment want all the things they're interested in the Constitution. This is normal.
Okay.
But and that we were in the same position. But as the conversation begins and to try and reach agreement, it's more likely that we'll reach agreement in broader principle, which is what happened in our context. And then certain things will be left to future specification by law. We're creating a democratic constitution. That's what we were doing in South Africa.
Okay.
And so it's obvious that something, but of course, people will argue to have some boundaries put in place in the constitution. Also some opportunities placed in the constitution. Yeah. Right? I mean, in our case, it was, we wanted the recognition of property rights. Some people wanted, there had to be. Others said, well, they have to be open. They can't be completely just like the property rights of the past. On the other hand, some people wanted socioeconomic rights. And some people felt that that was really a threat to them. And the question became how to put them in place so that people can see an opportunity in them. So even people who didn't like the idea could see, well, actually, it can work in this way. But the specificity was left out.
Yeah. But could you have a sense of how deep in terms of details the constituents would like to go eventually, or not?
No, I mean, I think it's still very early on, and the people I spoke to are just beginning these conversations. What was interesting to me was the thoughtfulness and the depth with which they were having these conversations, at least the conversations that I had the privilege of being to listen to and be participating. People were asking really solid questions and exploring them, and not saying, oh no, we can't talk about this or we can't talk about that. And for me, that's very hopeful, because people will, from different perspectives, were with different interests. We're saying, well, what might this mean for my perspective? And the questions I was being asked, I thought were really interesting, because they were questions that went to different perspectives on these issues.
Now, one last question. The Constitution, the South African Constitutional Convention lasts 2 years. You were during 2 years basically discussing the contents. Here we shall have...
We had a deadline date, 2 years, yeah, right?
2 years. But here we have 9 months. So my question is,
when I first arrived, I really thought, that's a really short period of time. But the more I've been thinking about it, I realized something else about our own experience. That of course, the Constitutional Assembly in South Africa was made up of the newly elected democratic parliament. And that parliament, so it was both the Senate and the House of Assembly that were together a 490-person Constitutional Assembly. But
as our, because we voted for two alternatives. One was the hybrid assembly and the pure assembly. So we took the pure. So they will not. Yeah, they are not concerned about the laws.
Exactly, but the point is, the reason you could do that is because you had a democratically elected legislature already. Yeah. We didn't, right? That's why we had to do both. But in terms of the timing, what that actually means is that in the same period of 2 years, half the time was being used on regular law, and half the time was being used on the So in fact, we did this in 1 year, not in 2 years, the constitution making process. And secondly, which is also important, is the decisions, the real decisions, particularly on the difficult issues, are not made for the first 8 months. They're really made in the last month, right? When people have been in the conversation, have been going around and around, but realize now, what is the alternative? We've agreed on quite a bit. Maybe we have some disagreements on some pieces, but are those pieces enough for us to walk away from everything we've achieved? So I think already this convention here in Chile has achieved something. It's worked out how to operate as a convention. And as it goes forward, it will make more achievements, and it'll be able to report to the public and to everybody about decisions it's made. And as it's doing that, it builds a momentum of its own about its own achievements that becomes very hard for anybody to walk away from. We had one party that didn't want to participate. The Inkatha Freedom Party. They were present in Parliament and were present in the convention, but they were not interested. They didn't agree. They thought there should be a different process. They disagreed with the process. They thought there should be a different process. And as a result, sadly, they got very little in. Many other parties who were not major parties got things into the constitution they wanted.
And you told me that the approval rate was something like 84%, 86%.
So we had a similar requirement that you've agreed to, and that is a 2/3 majority for a new constitution. Yeah. And what was interesting is, again, we had the worries, would we get the 2/3 majority? Even though the ANC itself, the dominant party, had a lot, it didn't have the 2/3. And so, but what happened is as people could agree on the broad outlines of a new constitution, not all the details, by the end, we got 86% agreeing to sign, to agree to vote for the final constitution, which was quite extraordinary, right? Yeah. But I think that the participants in it realize the value of trying to bring in as many people as possible, because this is going to be, as you say, the new rules of the game.
Okay, so last year, about this time, probably, we were discussing as well. We were introduced by our common friend, Javier Couso.
That's right.
And you participated in a seminar here at Lexen. So that was 1 year ago, more or less. You are now here in person. But it's interesting because next year, about the same time, we will be probably talking about already the results of the exit plebiscite. Wow. So it would be great to discuss with you, at least in 1 year time, but eventually before that, the outcome of our own process. I really thank you very much.
I learned so much this week, and I really look forward to learning more in time from the Chileans and to watch your process. I think it's really extraordinary.
Thank you very much, and let's keep in touch. We will need external review. I like very much the idea of external review. Permanent external review is useful for us. So thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Great to meet you. And
switch back to Spanish. Muchas gracias, Heinz. Muchas gracias a todos ustedes que nos han estado oyendo hoy día. Espero que les haya servido, que haya sido útil esta conversación con uno de los grandes expertos en el proceso sudafricano, que es de los primeros que comenzaron esta forma de hacer constituciones allá por los años 90 en Sudáfrica. Muchas gracias, Heinz, y hasta la próxima.
Gracias. Chao.